I'm going to show you how to create a pyroclastic firework now using two dynamic particle emitters and then applying hypervoxels to those emitters. So we're going to start out by clicking the Items tab up on top here, going to Dynamic Object, and selecting Particle. And emitter type, we want HV emitter, and we're going to call this emitter Main Emit. And this is going to create, click OK, and this is going to create our initial particles from which we'll be emitting other particles from these particles. And now we want to open up the Objects panel, and then go to Dynamics tab and double-click on Emitter. And in order to get to the Objects panel, you just make sure you have Object selected and hit Properties down here, or you can hit P on the keyboard with an object selected, and it'll bring you into this dialog. Okay, we want to set our particle limit. We want to have 250 particles. And actually, I want to set our time slider. We're going to make this 150. And so we're going to set our lifetime of our particles to 150. Cancel. And I just accidentally created a key if you're wondering what that was. We want to set our generator size, and we'll set it to 0.5 on all axis, which is 500 millimeters. And if you look here, you can see all of our particles are being created in a couple of seconds. But we want to break that down a little. So we're actually going to type in 200. And that way we get most of our particles being created within the first 30 frames. And then a few more after that. We want to set up our motion. So what we're going to do is select our explosion, and we're going to set that to 3.5 and just take a look and see how that. And that looks like it's okay, except we have our resistance on. So we're going to select the particle tab, turn off our resistance so that we have a nice fluid movement. Okay, that looks like it's going to be alright. We might actually go to our generator and turn our birth rate down a little to 150, just so it lasts a little bit longer, because now that I'm looking at it, it looks like it should last a little longer. We also want to add, since this is kind of a firework, we want to add some gravity. So we're going to click the ETC tab, and we're not going to use a typical gravity is negative 9.8, but of course this is sort of a fiery object, smoky object, because therefore it's not going to fall as quickly as a regular object would, as like if it was a rock or something like that. So we're just going to type in -3 and take a look at that, and that looks like it's a bit too much. So even -1. And that looks like it's going to be okay. But I'm kind of noticing that 250 seems like it's going to be too many particles. So we're going to go back and change that, just because we don't want to tie up the scene with too many particles, because what we're going to do is create another emitter, which is going to take each one of these points from this emitter and turn it into a point, or into an emitter itself. So pretty much how many emitters do we want to have? And at this point we have 75. And what I also want to do is maybe even tone that down, the generator size to 0.1. So we're emitting from a small object and then spanning out. And our gravity, even we'll change that down a bit, maybe to 0.5, negative 0.5, so that it's going downward. Because if we were to use 0.5, it would go straight up. And that looks like it's going to be okay. Now what we want to do is create another dynamic object and set it to particle, and we're going to call this trail emit, and then click OK. And we're going to set our nozzle to parent emitter. And what that's going to do now is take our parent emitter object, which we have to parent our object to this one. So we're going to hit M to pull up our motion options for trail emit and grab the parent item of main emit. And as you can see, that already kind of started creating those particles. Of course, we need to make several adjustments to them. So we're going to open up the object properties again and double click on the effects emitter for trail emit, and we want to set our lifetime to 150, and we need to up our particle limit to a very high amount. I'm going to set it to 25,000, and that's just so we know we have enough in the scene and as you can see, we already have kind of a neat looking effect from those particles. And actually, once we get up to that amount, I'm going to close this out and open that back up again. And we're actually using all of those particles. So I'm going to set it up to actually 50,000. Because as you can see in the scene up here, it tells you how many you're using. Right here, FX emitter 35,995. So that's how many particles we have in the scene for this object. Now we want to create some motion with this, but we can't use explode. Normally we would use explode, but what that's going to do is start shooting out the particles from each one of these new emitter type particles, and that's not the effect we're kind of looking at. We want kind of a nice trail behind it, which we already kind of have, but we want these particles to be spread out, and as you can tell, they're very close together and creating kind of bead trails. But if you're looking for that sort of effect, then this will be fine. I know some fireworks actually do look like that if you are going to be creating actual fireworks with this, but we're going to be applying hypervoxels. So we need to make some changes. We're going to pull up motion, and we want to add vibration. So if I change our vibration to 1, as you can see, that's really high. I might even go down to 0.25. And now you can kind of see that a little better, that we're getting a nice tight grouping at first, and then they spread out after an amount of time. And I'm going to hit calculate just to calculate these particles real quick. Just so we can get them working properly. Yeah, we've got some nice motion in there. And we're almost done here. And that's done calculating. And we've still got some leftover particles in the center, but that's going to happen. And actually that's okay, because once we have hypervoxels on anyway, we're going to want something in the center. And even at this point, you could still go in, like let's say you wanted to change your gravity of the initial emitter, you can still go and change that object, and it will reflect upon this secondary object that we've just made. And we can also change our vibration minimum. We can set that to 25%, and that way it will at least vibrate the particles a certain amount, and pretty much vibrate. In this case, is just kind of dispersing them. We're also going to change our birth rate, because right now we have it set to 100, but what that's actually doing is creating 100 particles per second from each one of these emitters. So we're of course going to want to change that. We'll change that to 50, and that makes a nice difference. The scene's moving a lot more fluid now too, and we have a lot less of those particles on the inside. If you want to, you can also change your particle resistance. If we change it to 0, I'll show you what happens. We get no trail really left behind, and they're all kind of shooting upward as each of the things move out. and that's because there's pretty much no weight. And we have a weight setting, but that's not really reflected because we could change the weight right now to 5, and really that wouldn't affect anything because the weight kind of goes along with particle resistance. So we'll change our resistance to 2 and see what that does. And it keeps them a lot more in that center point. And we could even bring it up to 10 and show you what happens. And what that does is it brings back our beating effect that we had before. But if you notice now, they're all emitting from the center and we don't have a gap. Because when we go to 2, you can see there's this gap in here. And that's because they're really not starting to fall behind up until they kind of leave the emitter box. And what we want is them to all be kind of shooting out from the center. And we have some points in there, but we don't want any gaps. So if we change our resistance up to 10, then that way there's no real gaps. It looks like there's one right here, but with our hypervoxels you won't be able to see it, not at that size anyway, because that's nice and small. And we can go back to our motion and change our vibration. We set it up to 1, and we kind of get that effect back. Set it up to 3, and we get it even more, but that's a bit too much. So we'll try 1.75. And we're kind of getting that effect back into it. And we don't really need to worry entirely about creating a nice little tip too, because we can do a lot of that within hypervoxels. And I'm going to go back to our generator. Our birth rate, that's still really high, so I'm going to change it to 30. Just because with hypervoxels we don't need to have that many. And as you can see too, these points kind of freeze. And to get them to sort of emit from the center as we have, it's adding that sort of freeze motion to it because it's not continuously moving. Once the particles are placed, they're not moving. And our hypervoxels texture will pretty much take care of that, so that's okay. And this is pretty much just the initial explosion. It's not going to be our fade out or anything. Of course, you could go ahead, make the animation a little longer, or if you wanted, you could just use a dissolve on the hypervoxels envelope, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. But we do want to get a little bit of our movement back in here, so we can change our resistance down to 5, and then go back to our vibration and change that to, say, 0.75. And that way we're still getting, they freeze at a certain point, but not so quickly right after they're emitted. They do move a little. And maybe even 1, just to give it a nice look in there. Okay, and that's pretty much our setup for our dynamics. If we were to create a firework out of this, we might want to change our lifetime to 75, and that way we get more of a look. And actually, if you look right here, we can see they start to dissipate at that level right there, but they really stop expanding a lot earlier than that. So we might change that to a lifetime of 50, and we'll see how that looks. I'm going to scrub through here, and you can see we get a nice little effect. And you can also use the hypervoxels with this too. And this way you have more of a fade out with the scene, and it's not kind of fixed once it reaches a certain rate. And this would be good if you wanted to, like I said, create a regular firework. And we'll go ahead and render something like that right now, just so I can show you if you want to create a standard firework using just particles and no hypervoxels, you could render it like this. But the only thing is, since we created this emitter as a hypervoxels object, if we hit if we go to render frame right now, there's nothing. And the reason for that is, once we created that dynamic object, went to particle, and we selected HV emitters do not show up. So we can't really render this right now to create our particle effect. So you always have to keep in mind what you want to do with it. But we mostly want to create a HV object, a nice Hypervoxels object. So we're going to go in and change that back to the way we had it. And we can come back, and then I'll show you how to render a particle object for the firework. So we're going to go back to our particle settings and change it back to 150. Oh, I created a key, so you can just hit delete key and 71. Just hit enter too many times. And now we can start looking at our hypervoxels. So I'm going to switch to the camera view and set it to 0. And make sure we select the camera with Shift C and then hit T on the keyboard for move. And we just want to move this into place so that we can frame it, because we are going to be using the Viper to preview our explosion. And actually right now, I might want to bring this down just a little, because it looks like we have too many trails in here. So if I go back to Object and go to our main emitter, Objects panel, and I can change our particle limit to, let's say, 45. You can see there's a lot less trails in there now. And because of that, we can also go in to the trail emitter, up our vibration to 1.4. Even our birth rate, we could change that up to 45. Or even higher if we wanted to. But that should be good right now. And now we're going to apply hypervoxels to this. So hit Control and F6, and that'll bring up our volumetrics tab under Effects. And we're going to turn off volumetric anti-aliasing right now. And select Add Volumetric Hypervoxels. Double click on Hypervoxels. And then we can close out our effects panel right here. And I'm also going to hit F7 on the keyboard to open up Viper, so we can get a nice preview of those hypervoxels. And right now we don't see anything, and that's because our object isn't activated. So if we double click on Trail, as you can see, it will start to render our default hypervoxel, which is just a gray blob, and that's all kind of blending together. Well, since we want to kind of create a pyroclastic smoke effect, we need to set this from object type from surface to volume. And that's already going to kind of give it a smoky texture. But as you can see, it's very rounded on these edges right here. It's not pointed as it should be, and there's not as much disturbance as I'd like to see. So I can go to our texture effect and set it to turbulence, and that will add an extra effect onto it. So that's mostly for animation, but it does give it an appearance for still frames as well. And mostly for the animation, what that's going to do is just kind of displace the texture a little, just have it kind of boiling a little, even though there are other effects for that. But turbulence is what we'll be using, and I can show you a preview of that in just a little bit. Okay, our texture right now is at crumple, and we could also change that to turbulence, which will give us a different type of smoke. And I have this on draft mode right now, so you can't really see the full effect, but you can kind of get an idea. But turbulence, I'm going to use the turbulence along with the turbulence texture effect, and I'm going to change the small power to 0.75, and that's going to add a little more grit in there in the smoke. Change the contrast to 15, and that will give us more spacing in between each one of the peaks, and our frequency will up it to 5. Our scale, we'll go ahead and change to 1.5. Just make it a little bit bigger, and what that's doing is changing this turbulence procedural so that we have more spacing in between certain parts of the objects. And actually what I want to do now is we've got this black background and you really can't see what's going on. So Control F5 and it'll bring up our backdrop settings under effects. I'm going to switch to gradient backdrop, and if we render that, you can get a preview of what it looks like. But we have this kind of brown looking thing right here, and that's kind of getting in the way, so we don't want that. So we're going to change our ground color by clicking on that color right there, a little swatch, and we can use our RGB values to type in on the side right here of the sky color, which is that bottom color right here. So we type in 120, hit tab, type in 180, hit tab, type in 240, click OK. And then this brown color, which is the other part of the ground, the highest color, we can just change that to a darker blue, and that doesn't have to match up with the other one because it won't be seen, and they don't blend together. It's that center two that will blend together. And now we just have a nice little backdrop that can show us our shadows and where the dark areas are. Okay, we can adjust our particle size if we wanted to make it just a little bit bigger. As you can see, it's because these ones are a little small. But as you notice, we still have this rounded effect on there. This is part of an explosion where rocks are shooting out, like let's say a volcano explodes. And of course the direction, there wouldn't be gravity on this, it would be facing the other direction. But still the same kind of effect. If we wanted to have rocks in here, they wouldn't be so large on the end. It would be a lot smaller. It would have a kind of a pointed tip on it. So what we need to do is create an envelope for the particle size over time. So if we click, or actually not an envelope, but a texture, sorry, a gradient. So if we click the T next to particle size, and we're going to change this from image map to gradient, and input parameter is time. And as you can see down here, it says end 30. Well, what that means is end 30, the end of this gradient is 30 frames. So this is a gradient for 30 frames of the animation. Well, we have a much larger animation than 30 frames, so we're not going to change it all the way, because once we reach a certain point, we're not really going to need that tip anymore, and pretty much just the particles kind of expanding by themselves will take care of that effect that we're going to need. So we can set this up to, let's say, 100 frames as opposed to 150. And now we're going to create, just by clicking in this area right here, you can create another instance where we can change our value. And if we change this value down to, down nice and low, you can see that the bottom is the tip. And if we change our value on top to even higher, we get a much thicker from the base. And we'll go ahead and change this down. And it's affecting quite a bit of it. So what we can do is, we'll just change that, and we're going to add another instance in here, and we can move it down just so we're not fading so much away. And we're going to move that up a bit. And we'll scale that down. So we'll just type in 350. Oh. And if you ever want to delete these instances, you just click the X on the side, and if you want to move them, this arrow is on the other side right here. And this value we want to bring down a lot lower. And then we want to bring this in. And actually we had it set to the wrong. Okay, and what we have here, we're going to change our layer type to gradient, And if you see right here, this is our gradient, and our end is at 1 right now, so we need to change our input parameter to particle age. And our end is 30, which means 30 frames, so 1 second. So it's showing the size within 1 second. We want to change that a little higher, not all the way to 150, because it's going to reach a certain point where we really don't need it to keep expanding, and we just kind of want to worry about the tips right now, because the rest of it looks like it's going to be okay. So we'll set it to, let's say, 130. Alright, now we want to add another sort of parameter in there, and now we need to start adjusting the value, and we need to just figure out which side is which. So if we change this to 0, you can see that the bottom is our central point, our starting point of the emitter, and that's kind of a neat effect. So if you're looking for kind of fireballs looking like that, it gives our spacing the inside, and we don't really have to worry about adjusting the dynamics of it, and we can do that on the hypervoxels, and that way we can kind of get kind of meteorite type of things, but we're not looking for that kind of effect right now. So we're going to set this to 20, or actually, since we're on the wrong side, we have to set it to 100, and we're going to go to our top one, and we'll set that to 20. And you can see that it starts making our tips nice and pointed, but we've got a little bit of spacing in here, and we want it a little thicker in the inside, and it kind of looks like a palm tree almost right now, so we want to make it a little bit bigger. So we're going to take this bottom value, and we're going to go above 100, and as you can see, it's making it darker right here, but it's just kind of compensating for the fact that normally white is 100 and black is 0, so it's going to have to change the gradient a little, and actually 300 looks like it's a little high. We'll change that to, let's say, 153. And that still looks a little weird. It's not quite puffing up as much as we want, so we can add another parameter in here, and go ahead, and actually I'm going to delete that, and I'm going to select it from lower, and that's going to keep that same color that we have, that same value, and it's just going to change from this point on to that tip. And as you can see, that looks a lot better. We could even adjust that a little bit more. But before we go ahead and do that, I want to change our actual particle object. So I'm just going to minimize these windows right now, and I'm going to adjust the dynamics of the initial explosion, just because I want them shooting upward. So go to frame 0, and we're going to select the camera, hit T on the keyboard to move. And this is all going to be shooting upward now. So I'm going to position it right here, and that should be alright. So now we're going to select, so we can't really see that object, we're just going to close the Viper right now, and we'll grab our select object, so Shift O, and then we can grab our main emitter object, and then hit P on the keyboard to pull up our object properties for that. And we'll double click on it, go to ETC, go to gravity, and we're going to set that to 1, and then see how our particles react. And as you can see, by changing that gravity, it still doesn't look like an explosion. It looks just like an upside down firework. And that's because we really shouldn't be changing the gravity. So negative 0.5, and then we get it back to where we were. What we really want to change is the velocity. So we go to motion, and we're going to change the velocity on the Y to 1. And that still doesn't look like it's high enough, so we'll set that to 2.5, because we're going to want kind of a big explosion. And maybe even down to 2, not so much. And you can see now we're getting it so it shoots out, but gravity still takes effect in the negative, and the particles start to come down. And we can even go ahead and change our gravity to negative 0.75, so they go down even farther and start to curl before that instance. And that just gives kind of a neat explosion effect. So you could have debris shooting out of the object and just smoke trailing after it. I'm going to pull up our Hypervoxels window again, hit F7 to bring back our Viper, and go ahead and do a test render of this. And as you can see, by doing that, it did make some changes to our particles, but we still have our gradient open, so we can make some changes to that. And we can see our tips kind of coming back. We can go to our value and kind of lower that if we want to. The only problem is, if we lower it too much, then we're going to get kind of that spacing that we have in here that you can see. So if we set this up to 30 and then increase the value, we'll still be able to get our kind of pointed tip effect without losing any of our geometry in there, or rather our voxels. I'm going to click Use Texture, and we can go to the shading options now, and we might want to change the color, because if it's going to be smoke, it should be a little darker. So we can just change, just by selecting the color and changing it to any darkness that we want. And since it's just basic smoke, actually the default for this works really well, and you really don't have to make too many changes to the actual object itself. You could change the thickness if you wanted to make it a little bit thicker. But this is actually, once we render this, it's going to look really good, and it actually looks like smoke at our default value. Our illumination is all fine. You can change your shadow quality depending on how quickly you want it to render. You can turn on volumetric shadows or turn off volumetric shadows. One thing that will definitely speed up the process is if you're turning off textured shadows. But as you can see, then we get a lot of weird looking effects in there. And that kind of brings back our depth without those harsh shadows. You can adjust the shadow strength, so we can bring it to 25, and that kind of lightens it up a little. And if we want to talk about the near clip distance, and what that is how quickly the hypervoxels pretty much give away, depending on how close they are to the camera. And right now it's at 67, and that's fine. The default for that is fine. We're not going to be flying into it. And our hypertexture for our turbulence, 50 should be fine. If we do a preview render of that, you'll be able to see the displacement, and we'll do that in just a sec. But first I want to show you what else you could do with this object. If we go ahead and turn on our main emitter, and that is pretty much the tips to each one of those trails, we can edit those. Let's say we wanted to turn those into rocks. We'll go ahead and first we'll scale those down. We can pull up our presets panel, because there's a few rock presets in there we can use, and that way we don't have to make anything custom. And hit F8 on the keyboard to bring up our preset panel. And if we select rock, there's a few neat ones in here. You could use lava, and that's kind of fiery. So if we double click on that, just let it change the particle size, and that will show up on the tips of the objects. Now right now we have our preview options in the Viper, and what this is doing is it's showing which object is selected. But let's say we wanted to look at both of them at the same time. You could just click on preview options and go to scene preview, and that will show you all of your hypervoxels together. Unfortunately, if you have volumetric lighting, it won't show you volumetric lighting settings more than just the one you're looking at, and it won't mix with hypervoxels. Hopefully we could see something like that, maybe a 9.0, but right now we don't have it. And now, as you can see, we have these rocks kind of on the tips. We could change the size of them, of course, and that's just kind of a neat looking effect. And what we could also do is, let's say we wanted to turn this into kind of fire. So we set our trail emitter to the selected object. We go to shading, basic, and select a color texture. We're going to change our layer type to gradient. And right now we have it set to previous layer. Well, what we want to do is set this to particle age again, and that way we can define how it changes color throughout its age or its lifespan. And we'll set this to 150 and go ahead and throw another parameter in there. And if we change this, actually we'll put another one in here too, and we can change this first color to like a bright yellow, and that'll give our tips a bright yellow look. And then we could do an orange. Oops, sorry. I'll do an orange on that second one. And go to that first one and change it back to kind of a yellow. And as you can see, it's not really showing all the particles right now, just because our time is set so high. But we can even space that out. And this last one, we could change that to like a dark gray, and so it's turning into smoke after that fact. But it still looks a little weird, and that's mostly because we don't have any luminosity. So we're going to click Use Texture, and we can go to Geometry, or sorry, Shading, Basic, Luminosity, and we can add a gradient for our luminosity. So go to the Texture Editor for that, change it to Gradient, set to Particle Age, change this up to 150. And actually what we can go ahead and do, if you really wanted to, we could just use this texture right now, go to our color, copy the selected layer, use the texture, go to luminosity, paste and replace all layers. And that way we already have our gradient in there. Of course, our values are set too low, but that way we have our parameters in the same places and we don't really have to go about changing them. We're going to select our top value, and we're going to change that up to 150, and our second one also to 150 for value. And that's nice and bright. And this next one, we can change our value to 50. And then you can use the texture. And that just gives you a real neat looking effect. Just something a little extra if you wanted to create, like I said, a different type of effect. You could also go into that particle size like we did before and just swap. So if we inverted it, what it would do is just flip around our gradient, and as you can see, now we have balls of fire kind of shooting out. And I'll change that down a bit, and you can kind of see the effect that it's giving. And you could also do it like this to create fireworks. And I'm going to show you in a minute the other way to create a firework, which is just by rendering the particles with a glow effect. But I just thought I'd show you this. It's kind of neat. You could just have extra fireballs shooting out of things. But we're going to go ahead and turn that back to the way it was. And also, we can remove our textures and bring it back to that smoke we had. I'm going to go ahead right now and turn off that main emitter. What you can also do, if you don't feel you have a good enough tip on the end, you could even click on the trail, copy it, and go and paste it onto the main emitter, and then just go to the geometry, and we can remove that texture and just change the size so it's real tiny, but you can still see it. So we just have little balls, and that might make your tips look a little better, just because we already have something there. But that doesn't always work, because sometimes those particles don't always stay with the trail. So we'll just go ahead and turn that off. But I'm going to do a little preview render to kind of show you what it's going to look like with Turbulence on, that texture effect that we have under Hypertexture. So go to Preview, Make Preview, and it'll just start rendering everything out. And I'm just going to show you that when it's done. Okay, I finished the render. I stopped it at actually 107. And I'm just going to show it to you at that amount. And just because I just want to show you pretty much what that texture looks like. So we play it, you can see it's got a nice billowing effect in here. And of course you can adjust that amount if we go to our hypertexture, and the effect speed will of course change that. And actually this looks like it's going a little fast. We could change it down to 50% if we wanted. But you pretty much get the idea. And of course, as you change your light in your scene, because right now the way our lighting is set up, we get that real dark spot in there. So we might want to angle the camera a little, and everything is set up to our distant light right now. If we go to our shading advanced options, you can select which lights, 2 main lights, or you can use all lights. So you get a choice of 2 or all of them. You could also set up your ambient color in there too, and that's pretty much just this level. And here, if we were to go ahead and just render right now, up our ambient amount, it will lighten up those areas that are not being shown by light. I'll go ahead and change that down and close that out. And I actually want to load in a scene that I already have finished. There we go. And this is actually the scene from the box cover. Actually, I think there might have even been one more before this. Okay, actually we did have one other newer version of it that was more edited. And we went ahead and did a render of this already at 1024 by 768, and I'm just going to pull that up for you now. Okay, and this is what we have for our render. As you can see, we do have a little bit of spotting in here that we could of course clean up, but overall the texture looks real good in here. We have that nice pointed look. I went and added a kind of orange and yellow gradient in the background, and I also changed the light color, because if you do change the light colors, it does affect your hypervoxels. And as you can see, it's a little yellower in here and it's not so gray, and that's just because I added a nice yellow light to it. So that's pretty much that effect there. And now we can go and take a look at how to set up the same effect using and rendering just particles with glow effect.